Welcome. My name is Piper Hendricks. I'm the CEO of Stories Change Power, and I'm so glad that you're here. Today's speakers picked a really fun song to welcome you, and I particularly appreciate the lyrics recognizing that life can be sometimes more than a little complicated and that we need to keep moving with high hopes. This conversation feels really timely as some of the most damaging fires in California history continue in and around LA. As we hear stories both of tragedy and hope, our hearts are with the people there now and throughout what will be a long recovery. Before we move into our discussion about trauma-informed storytelling, a quick note about Stories Change Power. We provide practical strategies for making a difference in your neighborhood, community, and country as an effective, empathetic, and trusted advocate. We do that through learning communities, workshops, and one-on-one coaching. For today, I'll flag our customized workshops. If you are an organization planning your 2025 Hill or legislative days, and you're telling your advocates to tell your story without ensuring that they really know what that means, let's talk. For everyone, whether you're planning a Hill day or not, stay on the yellow loop with us by following us on LinkedIn. 5 things before I introduce our speakers. 1, we're able to offer this monthly series for free with support from sponsors. Thank you to the National Center for Weight and Wellness for sponsoring today's talk. Their team of physicians, psychologists, nutrition, and education and exercise specialists treat patients across the country, including many who have experienced trauma. We appreciate your support. 2, we keep the chat open for constructive conversation. We welcome your thoughts along the way, and where you have questions, please put those in the Q&A. You'll see a box at the bottom of your screen. If we can't reach your question today, we will in an upcoming newsletter or on LinkedIn. Third, we have the captions enabled, so please use those if they are helpful to you. Fourth, if you have any tech difficulties, don't worry, we will share the recording. And fifth, as a webinar, you're off camera and your microphone is off. So I encourage you to do what you need to do to be fully present and take good care of yourself as we address some really big topics. And with that, it is an absolute pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Cody Hays and Dr. Kelly Chernin, both fellow members of the Public Interest Communications Educators Network. Cody is the founder of Marketing Mission, which supports nonprofit executive directors, development directors, and communication strategists with the coaching and consulting they need to maximize their marketing and reclaim their time. Who doesn't need more time? They created the organization in 2020 after a career in social media for multi-million-dollar nonprofits across the country. Cody holds a master's degree in mass communication and digital strategy from the University of Florida and a bachelor's degree in education from Northern Arizona University. Welcome, Cody. Kelly is an assistant professor in the communication department at Appalachian State University. Her research focuses on how communicators can better tell stories to get stakeholders to care about important causes, which, as we know, is at the core of advocacy. Kelly is a current editor of the Journal of Public Interest Communications and interested in how communicators can help scientists present their findings to the general public more effectively. Kelly's previous research explored social movements and how memory influences future democratic change in the wake of mass communications in China and Hong Kong. She earned a BA in communications from American University and an MA and PhD in mass communications from Pennsylvania State University. Welcome, Kelly. I'm so glad that you're here today. Before I turn it over to our speakers, we want to understand who is with us on the call. So we will have a poll pop up in just a moment with 2 questions. You'll see those on your screen now. Our first question is, how long have you worked in advocacy? We've got a variety of options there, less than 2 years, 3 to 7 years, 7 to 10 years, even more than 10 years if you're a pro. And then, as always, our webinars are open to everyone. So if you don't, if there's nothing about advocacy in your work day to day, that 5th option is there for you. Our second question is, what type of trauma-informed strategies have you used in your advocacy work? And this one, you can pick as many as are applicable to you. We've got building trust and safety with clients or communities. Second, providing resources for mental health support. Third, avoiding re-traumatization in communication. And then maybe you haven't used any of these specific strategies yet. So I see a lot of poll responses coming in. If you've not responded to those yet, we'll give you a few more moments, or if it's easier to do that in the chat, please feel free to pop your answers in there. We're about 60%. We'll give folks maybe another few seconds. And again, if you prefer to use the chat, that is a-okay. But we will close the poll in maybe 3, 2, 1. Let's go ahead and end that. And as you can see, we've got quite a variety of folks all across the board, Cody and Kelly, when it comes to how long folks have worked in advocacy, and about a fifth of us who aren't in advocacy. Welcome. We're really glad that you're here. And then for building trust and safety, about 2/3 of folks have used trauma-informed strategies to that end, about 30% and resources for mental health support, half for avoiding retraumatization, and then about a quarter of us have not used those strategies yet. So thank you, everybody. We will stop sharing that poll. It's helpful to know who's here. And with that, Kelly and Cody, I will turn it over to you.
Okay. I guess I will start quickly. Thank you all for being here. Just kind of a quick introduction. Both Cody and I work for the Journal of Public Interest Communications, and as many of you are practitioners, our journal is a really kind of unique space where we do explore a lot of these topics like trauma-informed narratives. We also are a space that really does try to combine research and practitioner content, which is something that we don't see a lot of. So if you are a practitioner, you do want to get involved with the journal, please go to our website. Or you can just Google Journal of Public Interest Communications, and you'll see a lot of the strategies that we are talking about now, and also research that backs it up. And it is an open access journal because we are strong believers and advocates that the research that we do in the academy is something that everybody should get access to. So with that, I will leave it to my amazing co-editor, Cody Hays.
Hello, everyone. Hello, hello. How are you doing today? So grateful that you all are deciding to spend your Friday mornings with us, or maybe Friday noons if you're on the East Coast. I am not. I am on the West Coast. So today we are going to be talking about trauma-informed storytelling and how specifically to conduct interviews that are empowering and inspirational. And we're going to go through a few different objectives today. First being, how do we build this trust and rapport during interviews? Then how do we craft these thoughtful, open-ended questions? And third, how do we recognize and mitigate re-traumatization? And then number four, how do we highlight diverse voices while honoring story integrity? Before we get started, though, I want to walk us through the principles of trauma-informed storytelling by giving a lovely definition. So, trauma-informed storytelling is a method of capturing and sharing stories that prioritize the safety, dignity, and the well-being of the storyteller. It recognizes the potential for re-traumatization when recounting sensitive or personal experiences and seeks to empower individuals by giving them agency over how their stories are told. This approach really ensures that narratives are shared in a way that is respectful, ethical, inclusive, and fosters trust and ultimately promotes healing. So there's a few key principles that we go through in relation to trauma-informed storytelling. The first being safety. We want to ensure that there's a supportive environment where storytellers are feeling secure and valued. Then we want to make sure that there is trustworthiness and transparency. This allows storytellers to really build this foundation of mutual respect and reliability between the storyteller and the interviewer. We want to make sure that there are peer support because we want to build this mutual sense of respect and reliability again between those two of the storyteller and the interviewer. We want to make sure that they have agency as well and control over how their stories are shared and told. We want to make sure that, of course, we're empowering individuals as well. So we want to avoid exploitation and sensationalism, instead focusing on authenticity and accuracy in our storytelling. And then, of course, we want to consider these cultural, historical, and gender considerations, and ultimately to build a more inclusive storytelling process. Before we dive in, I do want to pull up a few examples. There's 4 different articles that we're really building and referencing, and these do come out of the journal, like Kelly introduced. And all 4 of these are interviews with practitioners. So not researchers, they're folks that are doing communications, social media consultancy, or working in philanthropy. And we're getting their perspective on how do we really build an interview process that is inclusive and feels safe. So we have 4 that we'll be referencing throughout. The first one being an inclusionary wake-up call for public interest copywriters. This really sets the foundation of how we are using word choice and how we are framing stories. And then we'll also talk a little bit about Floyd's piece here on centering Black philanthropy and crafting communications that champion investment in diversity. We also have a piece from Alira Conga on a different way to communicate, which is through puppets. And realizing we don't always have to use our solely rely on our words in order to meet our audience where they are. And in the case of this article, the audience was people 5 years old and younger. So a fun little twist in there. And then where we'll be spending a majority of our time today actually comes out of this practitioner Q&A with Brooke Kaufman and Jennifer Smith with the Seattle Clemency Project. So we're going to be using them really as our case study here and highlighting their story and the storytelling that they've done. And all 4 of the links that to these articles will be shared at the end of our session today. Highly, highly recommend reading them because in addition to what we're sharing here today, each one of these articles also has practitioner takeaways and literal bullet points of like, do this, do this, do this, do this. And so if you're really wanting to get into the weeds of how do we build a storytelling or interview process, highly recommend diving into especially the first one we mentioned here and the last one we mentioned on this side.
Yeah, and I'll also jump in to say from the research perspective, one of the things that's really important that we really pride with the journal is you're going to get practitioner insight, but because we, have academic side as well, we do also back that up with research. So you'll see, these aren't just strategies that we're coming up with, off the top of our head. These are backed by research, and we share that with you as well.
Absolutely. All right. So before we dive into these strategies, though, I want to share an example of how storytelling can be used to empower individuals and inspire change. So Seattle Clemency Project is an organization that connects people who are serving long sentences with pro bono legal assistance. So they use storytelling not only to advocate for justice, but to reshape public perceptions about redemption and second chances. So through their work, they've helped countless individuals transform their lives and reconnect with their communities and feel good throughout that process. So we're going to watch about a 5-minute video that really showcases their approach to storytelling. It's how they center the voices of those that they serve while maintaining dignity, authenticity, and respect. So as we're watching, I want you to pay close attention to how the stories are framed to highlight personal growth and transformation. I want you to pay attention to the balance between sharing challenges and celebrating successes. And I want you to pay attention to the emotional and the ethical considerations that might be popping up in your head as you are analyzing this storytelling approach. For context, this video came from and was produced not by Seattle Clemency Project, but by a funder of Seattle Clemency Project. So you can see the additional layers, and I personally appreciate the way Seattle Clemency Project said, we're going to stick to our approach throughout this process, even when, in quote, pressured by external foundations, funders, stakeholders. So with that, let me make sure I am sharing my sound.
When we first started the Seattle Clemency Project, we had a pretty simple idea that we had a lot of people in prison who had done time beyond which it was serving a valid purpose. We wanted to provide free legal services to those individuals in response to a systemic problem that we saw. Washington abolished parole in 1984. And what that meant for our system of justice was that a lot of people who are sent to prison for life and long sentences went there with no review based on their rehabilitation.
These reformed individuals that are currently incarcerated have very few opportunities to demonstrate that maturation and reform. They do not have a right to counsel.
When we started going into the prisons, what we found were some of the most powerful people we'd ever met. And we told lawyers that there was an opportunity for them to tell stories about extraordinary people who are in our prisons, and to tell the Clemency Board and the governor that we are missing out in our community by not having these people back in it. One of the things that I've really learned is just how critical our pro bono legal community is.
Volunteering your time can mean that one more person has a just outcome. It can mean that one more person has an opportunity to earn their freedom. And volunteering your time does mean that you're going to be joining a community of talented professionals who are working to change our state's relationship with mass incarceration.
Although Washington's population is only 3.5% African American, 28% of people who have received life and long sentences are Black. And so there's a racial disproportionality that has been part of our screening process as we identify people who are good candidates to be matched with lawyers. The Legal Foundation of Washington was one of the first foundations to fund us. Over the last 6 years, we've been able to match 235 people with volunteer lawyers, and we've generated over $9 million in free legal services. 82 people with life or long sentences have been released from prison. That's 1,141 years of incarceration saved. That's $44 million of incarceration costs saved.
I've seen men and women who were teenagers when they went to prison, and coming to prison at 16 years old and being released at 50, it's a whole different world. And that's where we come in reentry. We want to get people when they're inside, before they even come home. We want to teach them what it's like to be in society, what it's like to have a job, what it's like for finances. We're up to like 42 people so far who are now homeowners. They're wanting to be business owners now. They're wanting to get involved in different organizations. We formed the mentor group. It's not just people who were formerly incarcerated. There's also community members, family members. There's victims, there's attorneys, former judges, former Department of Corrections staff. And what we're doing is we're healing wounds together.
Michael and Cheryl Lydell are siblings who were both given life sentences under the 3 strikes law. They both mentored other people in prison. Fortunately, they both were granted early release, and now they're both out doing incredible things in the community.
I didn't see my beloved brother for 41 years. You need to understand what a miracle looks like when you see it. The first thing I had to do was forgive those who trespassed against me. Then I began to forgive myself. And then I began to take off and fly. Now, I did not go to college. I do not have a degree, but I am qualified to take somebody by their hand and lead them out of brokenness.
I had 56 years to do, 40 for the state, 16 for the feds. And I was told that I was a de facto lifer. Being rescued by Camilla Mann and David Heiner and Jennifer Smith and Willa Osborne and the entire Clemency Project, right, raised me from a well, a dark, dungy well where there was no light. I want you guys to understand that those people in there need you like they need water to drink, like they need air to breathe, like they need family to love. That's what the Clemency Project has become to me, my family.
One of the things about the Seattle Clemency Project, when I first came on board, I felt like I got a hug from everybody in the entire organization, and they've never stopped hugging me. And everyone that we've helped, touched in some sort of way, is receiving that same hug. We can change people, whether it's one victim at a time, one community at a time, one city at a time, but we can change this world.
Well, come on, my friend. That is just something else. I have watched this video probably 10 times and I tear up every time. And just because of the power of that transformative story and the fact that we didn't just hear from the funders. We didn't just hear from the organization leaders. And when we did, we heard their personal stories and how they were connected to that cause. So, um, if you have a moment after this, highly recommend looking up Seattle Clemency Project. I'll do a plug for them before we dive in. They just released a book of 12 different stories told by folks who are currently or formerly incarcerated. And it's been a 2-year process that they've been working on. And so I highly recommend if you're wanting to read an interview or 12 and that go through this process and are a good showcase of what we're about to talk about, highly, highly recommend. All right. But let's dive into it. We'll start by building trust and relationships. So Seattle Clemency Project prioritizes their trust and fostering these personal connections through these face-to-face meetings with clients. What they do specifically when they're wanting to meet with someone is they'll go into prison and meet the person there. And they're not trying to schmooze them or bring them anything. They're just trying to allow their clients to feel seen, feel heard, and valued as individuals. And they make very clear from that very first moment in time with them that the client has full control over their narrative, including what they choose to share, if it aligns with their comfort level, and what their personal boundaries are. Brooke from Seattle Clemency Project also, when we were talking, said, I've gotten to the very last interview with a client, and then at the end of that interview, they say, you know what, Brooke, I don't know if I actually want to tell this story. And she says, sure, we've invested tons of hours and time into this, but that doesn't matter because this person no longer wants their story to be told. And she said, when that happens, no questions asked. So trust is this cornerstone of effective storytelling, and without it, narratives risk feeling exploitative, misrepresentative, and potentially harming both the storyteller and the intended audience. Next up, we want to talk about crafting your open-ended questions. And so this can be a pretty critical skill in any interview process. It's what gets our folks to kind of open up. But with this, we want to also recognize that open-ended questions leave room for folks to kind of explain things in their own words. So they allow storytellers to share their experiences authentically without feeling boxed into a particular narrative that we as the interviewer are trying to push. So unlike this yes or no or leading questions, open-ended questions gives the storyteller space to reflect, space to decide how much they want to share and how they want to tell that story in their own words. And it fosters agency and empowerment, both of which are very important to our trauma-informed practices. So I told you we'd mention or reference a few other articles throughout this. I'm going to reference the Puppets in Public Health campaign from Alira. What they did here was use storytelling, or their storytelling used engaging narratives to really address sensitive health topics like vaccine hesitancy. They realized that parents are having a hard time communicating the need for vaccines to their children. Because if you've ever watched any like kid shows, vaccines can be really scary to kids. They're presented as this like, oh, open shock. Like I'm pretty sure Peppa Pig has a shot episode. So like Kelly, you might want to like get ready, prep for that one with Sawyer.
I have a 9-month-old for context.
um, And so what they did is realize, although the parents may be having a hard time communicating this, kids have questions still. And so the approach that they took with this was bringing puppet theater to life and prompting children with questions that during that puppet theater, they reported seeing the kids turn and look up to their parents and be like, what does this mean? And so this puppet theater also took place in an open forum at a park. And so didn't need tickets, didn't need to like RSVP. So you got kids at the park with their family being exposed to the importance of vaccines and then asking questions to their parents. And this technique made their stories not just impactful for the message that they're trying to get across, but went further beyond awareness into starting to um, uh, have conversations between families that are really these decision makers. All right. Next up is we want to emphasize personal transformation. And so these personal growth stories, like we saw with the brother and sister in that video, and these offer compelling alternatives to these narratives that have just been pushed and pushed and pushed by media throughout the years. And these stories are positive. They highlight resilience. They highlight capacity of change. They're paradigm shifts in a way, and breaking that mold and challenging stereotypes about individuals with past convictions. And so in that Seattle Clemency Project paper, we also talk about how one client, after 40 years in prison, he returned to his community, became a nonprofit program director, he became a pastor, and he ended up mentoring others and demonstrating potential for redemption and societal contributions. And that story is one that focuses then on the resilience and achievements and the future casting, the hope for the future. So I think by focusing on transformation, we can humanize these clients and these people that we are talking about in our roles, and tap into the potential for growth that they have. All right. Next up is our ethical considerations. We want to avoid sensationalism. We want to avoid this trauma porn. And all of that to be said, just don't be like Sarah McLachlan. Like, we don't want to have the Sarah McLachlan sad puppy videos. Um, um, we and why? Because overexposing these hardships risks diminishing people's integrity. And I often like to say, people who are experiencing trauma likely don't need to be reminded that they're experiencing that trauma because they know it, right? And by triggering that, that can actually put a hindrance in the way that our interviews proceed. And if we say, hey, we know if we open up and start to box people in to a corner that they may or may not identify with, or and maybe they identify with, but they have some negative emotions, that's going to close them off. They're not going to want to talk to you. And also, it kind of makes you an asshole. And so we just want to be respectful and respect that privacy and autonomy, especially when their stories involve sensitive or painful details. And so um, Seattle Clemency Project recognized that a way to counter this ethical consideration or a way to provide more ethical storytelling is actually to compensate the folks for their lived experiences. With Seattle Clemency Project, and specifically, they're interviewing folks for hours on end, and working on a publication like that book launch this month. And so realizing that they were going to profit off of stories, they said, oh, we need to make sure that the stories we're telling, they get compensation as well and continue to get compensation for that. We go into this in great detail actually in the article. And so if you're looking for resources, a breakdown, highly going to recommend pulling that up after this. It'll be in the chat in like 10 minutes. And then with that, giving your clients agency to review, retract, or edit narratives, ensuring comfort and control throughout the entire process.
So within academia, one of the things that's really fascinating is the fact that we've kind of already had this established. So this is something that is known as the IRB, or Institutional Review Board. As many of you know, if you've gotten higher degrees or you've done research at the institutional level, you have to go through this process before you can do any type of research. And so I actually, the research that I do is interview based. It is looking at narrative. It's looking at all these other things. And I'm not allowed to even start conducting my research until one, I've gone through training, and two, I've really thought about the open-ended questions that I'm asking, the harm that it's going to be doing. I have to do an extensive amount of research about the communities that I'm going into and the people I'm going to talk to have the historical understanding, the ethical considerations, and all of these other things. And one of the things that's unfortunately very frustrating, as I'm sure many of you know if you've tried to find research, is, academia is very siloed. We tend to be behind a paywall. And so while these things might seem new and that they're just being introduced now, this is something we've been working with within the academy for a really long time. And one of the things that's been really refreshing and exciting is the fact that these strategies are now being implemented in the actual world. It's something that we're teaching journalism students here at Appalachian State University and other programs that teach these kinds of classes as well. We're trying to instill this mentality. It doesn't always come across that way, unfortunately, but these are things that we've been thinking about for a really long time, and part of that is because there have been issues like trauma porn, as Cody has discussed, and this kind of exploitation, even within academia. If you think back to when we talk about research ethics and interviewing people and the experiments that we do with human subjects, you can think of the Stanford prison experiments. One of the reasons we have these boards is because in the 70s we did not, and there were some really horrible things. If you've seen the documentary Three Identical Strangers, it's kind of the same thing. Like, research was not done in a way that was focusing on actually caring for people. It was focusing on exploiting people so we could get our research results. And now one of the things that's, I think, really incredible, I shouldn't say incredible, all institutions have their issues, but one of the things that's embedded in this research process and the review process is we have to establish resources ahead of time before we can even start our research. So if somebody is traumatized and they are we tend to interview students a lot, for some projects. And so like if a student is triggered by something or traumatized by something, we have resources to the student health and mental health services on campus. When I was doing my own research in Hong Kong, I had tried to track down people who were willing to work with dissidents within Hong Kong who spoke Cantonese and everything else. Like, we have to track that stuff down. And so, if you're ever looking for a model because this seems new, if you're near a local university or an academic, just at least following these standards somewhat loosely could be really helpful for your own practice. Like, we're required to, the average person who's in the kind of practitioner world maybe isn't, but there are kind of resources available if you are looking for those things.
Love it. All right. So as you're engaging stakeholders, we want to make sure that you are thinking about everybody that is possibly in that room, right? And so using the Seattle Clemency Project, they were pulling in multiple audience members throughout that video, if you can remember back. Yes, they had the Seattle Clemency staff, so the executive director, Jennifer, but they were also pulling on their private lawyers, right? Because this was serving, and they need pro bono attorneys to help make their work possible. And so, in that story, they pulled in an attorney, and talked about the work there. And they also went and spoke with multiple clients, right? We see multiple channels of leadership and representation throughout these videos. And so when you are working on your interviews, think about what stories can we use that can educate the public about the potential for rehabilitation, or what paradigm shift we're trying to accomplish, and can we use empathy and challenging biases throughout this in the way that we actually interview folks. And so in order to engage these stakeholders, sometimes it is as easy as like asking, but sometimes you don't have those folks in your network. And so that's where you can leverage newsletters, in-person presentations, going to events like this and finding like-minded folks. And finding folks that are not like-minded, but you still have this connection point. Um, really want to make sure, you can also put that call out on social media, and ask, and even go searching on social media and see, is there someone out there that is doing this already that maybe we could collaborate with, and we don't have to reinvent this wheel here. The importance of this to be said that Seattle Clemency Project really uses the humanization of things to reframe the conversation around redemption and second chances in a way that I think isn't just talking about the crime that had occurred. That's not their focus. And so really as interviewers, we want to think about what is that goal? What is that end goal for the story? And what is the person that I'm interviewing? What do they have to contribute? And how can we learn and maybe even adapt our end goal as we are learning more and uncovering more throughout this? And then finally, finally, I think there might be one more slide. Second to finally, we want to make sure that you're amplifying voices while navigating sensitivities. And so stories that focus on positive outcome without erasing the realities of clients' past actions can be super beneficial when it comes to complicated orders, if you will. And so this approach respects the complexity of people's experience while highlighting capacity for growth. It's again recognizing a past, but realizing that their life did not end at that point, and they have lived and continue to live for many years beyond that. It's not a end decision maker for them. And so, in order to do this, a review process is really, really important. Some folks will include a review session specifically for that overall messaging and framing, and checking for biases in that language. And even going through a fact-checking process as well, to make sure that are some of these assumptions that we have actually based in facts. Kelly explained that's kind of how we also do these interviews with the journal, is making sure that yes, while you are telling us these things, we also want to make sure that it's bound and based in evidence. And so matching those can be super, super helpful. And ultimately just safeguard both your client's dignity and the integrity of the story that is being shared. Okay, this is the last piece, I promise, before our questions, which gets to mitigating re-traumatization. So, there are moments where if we as an individual interviewer don't do our homework, or don't recognize and don't pick up on the senses around us, we may risk re-traumatizing the people that we are speaking with. It's storytelling can be empowering, but it's also really important to recognize the potential risks, especially when the storyteller is recounting sensitive or traumatic experiences. So certain types of questions, like overly sensitive ones, or those requiring storytellers to go back to a moment when, or almost thrust themselves back into that moment, can re-traumatize them. And we saw that both being addressed in the Mr. Stethoscope's campaign, the vaccine awareness, where in this that took place in Albania, and so vaccines were a bit of a trauma experience for folks in Albania, and not wanting to, and they found that families were kind of re getting triggered because they were afraid of COVID and all of these uh, vaccine histories in Europe. And then also Seattle Clemency Project. And so both of these projects used strategies like prioritizing storytellers' comfort and framing questions in ways that felt safe and supportive to the individual and to the audience later on. And so some practical techniques that you can use is to offer breaks. Sometimes storytellers need to collect their thoughts or step away from a conversation. They need to take a deep breath. And so being patient and being flexible is super, super crucial here.
Yeah, and I'd say on a personal note, I know Piper had mentioned the fires that are happening in California, and I'm sure, a few of you are from those areas. One of the things that when we think about re-traumatizing a narrative, if you know where Appalachian State University is, it's Western North Carolina. We were severely impacted by Hurricane Helene. And one of the things when you're thinking about re-traumatizing narratives is, a lot of what we're seeing with misinformation and disinformation right now is having our tragedy that happened here in Helene, with Helene in Western North Carolina, being used against the aid and the help of the tragedy that is happening now in California. And so it's really important too, when we're thinking like offering breaks and trying to control the narrative, I think specifically is trying to make sure that you're not using somebody else's tragedy to kind of emphasize, make something better or worse. Like this idea of comparative tragedy is also really problematic. The other thing that was really sad, I think, when you think about how the media really focused on what was happening in Helene versus California is even just looking at people's backgrounds. Appalachia is known to be relatively poor, which is not the case in all of the locations in Appalachia. Boone is relatively wealthy. Same thing with Asheville. Doesn't make that recovery any worse or any better. So, taking out your own assumptions and biases is really important. But then to kind of say, oh, well, this group only got $750 versus another group, and kind of seeing that kind of refocused along is also really problematic when you're looking then at California and you're assuming that, oh, well, everybody who lives in these areas are very wealthy and very well off, and not taking into consideration that, these tragedies take a long time. We're still in recovery here in North Carolina. And California is going to go through a really long recovery too. So just like not just assuming that your trauma is over when the tragedy is over and like people move on is, I think, a really another important thing to think about.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right, Piper, I know we've been getting some questions in the chat, so we would love to answer them now.
Awesome. And I want to say thank you both. I really appreciate your combination of the practitioner and research perspective. And Kelly, appreciate your nod to the fact the good news is there's a lot of research and a lot of good practices out there, and we can bring that into more of the practitioner space, which I think, is reflecting with a fellow communications expert this morning, how we just weren't having this conversation in the nonprofit space many years ago. And I'm very grateful that we are now, and grateful to you both for bringing your expertise to the group today.
I will say, yeah, on that note, as academics, we love sharing our research. So if there's ever an article where you're like, oh my gosh, I found this, but it's behind a paywall, find the academic personally and email them, and we will send you our research. People don't think you can do that. And I don't know if we're allowed to or not, but we don't get paid for our research, and we just genuinely are doing this because we're excited. If you knew the salary that an academic made, you'd be like, oh, why do you do this for a living? But we do it because we love to do research, and we love finding these things. So if you do ever want an article and it's a paywall, just email the person. We will. I don't know too many academics who will not send you their piece. So
That is a fabulous tip. Thank you. I think that there's a lot of us on the call who do a lot of things for joy and not
Yep.
for the sake of our bank accounts. But, no, and I hear this bigger picture of, shifting from, I think, speaking from the nonprofit space, a lot of times there's pressure, get these stories, and people want to read the stories, which is a good thing. You're being funded to tell stories, but shifting that perspective from what the needs of the organization are to the needs of the person and the people whose stories you're sharing. So Cody, you're right. We're getting good questions. Folks, I encourage you, put any questions that you've got into the chat. If we're not able to get to them today, we will find a way to answer them later, and would love, we've got two experts here. I will take moderator's privilege to pose the first one, and then we'll move to a question from the Q&A. But what is a misconception about taking a trauma-informed approach that you would like to correct?
Oof. This is a tough question. Cody, do you have a thought?
Yeah, I think a common misconception is that a trauma-informed approach means you're going to avoid trauma or difficult topics altogether.
Mhm.
We can't guarantee that. In reality, it's not about avoiding the hard stuff. It's about creating a safe and supportive environment where those topics can be explored thoughtfully, thoroughly, and in a way that feels comfortable for all parties involved. We don't want to shield people from their stories, but we want to create a space that allows people to and empowers them even in a way that gets them to share that in a way that makes them feel comfortable and authentic. I think trauma-informed storytelling kind of balances that respect for the storyteller's boundaries and the understanding that sharing difficult experiences can also be healing and transformative when it's done in a supportive context.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, it's not one-sided. I think a lot of times when we're thinking about it from the perspective of we're interviewing, we tend to think of ourselves as, not affected or impacted by these things. And I can say, like, having my dissertation research was looking at, pro-democracy movements in Hong Kong, and you're talking to people who, I saw in the notes someone who was talking about like being, really traumatized by the election. That was happening in Hong Kong right after, the umbrella movement and everything else. And now a lot of the people that I was speaking with, are going to prison because they've still really tried to kind of focus on that pro-democracy message in Hong Kong. And it was really hard as a researcher to remain objective and not impacted by that. So, one of the things we talked about was this idea of like taking a break, and it's okay for you to also take a break and acknowledge that it impacts you as well. I switched to science communication because I was like, the phosphorus cells will stay the same, and just to give myself a break from that kind of research. It's not that I don't care about that anymore. I will go back to that eventually, but you have to give yourself space to process what is going on when you're talking to these things, to these individuals, and you're telling these stories as well, because when you're not giving yourself that grace to kind of process things, you are more likely to kind of re-traumatize those individuals as well when you don't recognize your own trauma with that.
It's a lot of sense, being human and recognizing our own humanity in the whole process. I want to turn, we've got two questions, it looks like, about specifically the compensating people and their stories. And we've got one saying that you noted when speaking with storytellers with lived experience, it's often standard to offer compensation for sharing stories and lived experience. How do you go about having those conversations with individuals about the compensation before interviewing and ensuring that the compensation does it influence folks' decision to share their story or interview? And I think I can loop in another one here regarding paying your participants. Wouldn't that open up, in this case, a filmmaker to accusations of controlling the narrative because of that payment? And if they've told participants what to say in order to support the point that the filmmaker is trying to make. That's a lot to put all in.
Um,
Yeah.
I will say in academia, like if you have grant and research money, it is common to kind of pay participants. You pay everybody a standard thing. So you just are upfront about that, and we have, again, research standards. So I'm going to kind of leave this one to Cody to say, like, yeah, it's like sometimes you get research, sometimes you don't. Sometimes that compensation is extra credit. So like for us in academia, it's just about kind of being equitable across the board and offering everybody compensation, and then being upfront that you paid somebody. That's something that we are also required to do. And whether like I don't you could probably apply those things to, practice, but Cody definitely has a lot more experience with that than I do.
Paying participants for sharing their stories, I think, is a great way to acknowledge the value of their time and the lived experience. Just like as the documentarian ideally wouldn't, I'm probably a wrong industry because a lot of documentarians do the work for free. But as most of us wouldn't volunteer to just spew all of our stories, it's important that we do this ethically and avoid any perception of coercion, like you were saying. And so I think that comes through multiple we can address that through multiple points. First one is transparency, and be clear that the payment is for their time and effort, not for the content of their narrative. And emphasize that they're free to share their story however they choose without expectations of shaping it or fitting it into a specific agenda. I oftentimes say, I have no agenda other than the 5 questions that I have listed here. And so if you, and I will be clear with them, if you don't want to answer these 5 questions, we can talk about something else. And you as the interviewee have really the control of how this conversation will go, and I'll take your lead. And with that, I think that's where that consent and the autonomy come in place as well. So we want to make sure that participants have and retain full control over that story, which means they should be able to review it, like all of the footage after it or the full transcript, and after they should be able to review and approve it prior to it being shared. So I know oftentimes we have that like raw, uncut piece and then a version that gets put in the final product. And that's not just a one-time consent piece, that's a multi-step consent process. And Seattle Clemency Project does a good job of actually, they have a contract that they sign, or that both the interviewer and the interviewee sign that speak to that specifically. And so that way, if there is any question, they can literally be like, no, this is what we agreed to. And have in that, of course, the reason why they're being compensated. And yeah, I think ultimately it's about communicating the purpose of the interview and the role that the stories play in that interview and ensuring that people understand there's no pressure to say or present anything specific. We're here just to talk, and if something comes of it, you will have the autonomy to choose whether or not your portion of that story gets told with this larger piece that we're sharing.
I love that. It sounds like having the control and clarity from the very beginning, and then seeing, in the case of a film, the rough, the fine, and the final cut, and having them involved all along the way makes a ton of sense. We're getting great questions. I'll turn to one from Edgar here, who says, re-traumatizing an interviewee can be unpredictable, even with thorough preparation. If this does happen, what steps should be taken to address the situation appropriately? Would having a trauma counselor available be a helpful solution?
Yes. That's something that, especially like anytime we're doing anything on campus, like we usually notify the student health services or mental health services. And as I mentioned before, I didn't need to do this, but just knowing and having somebody who is available to talk to that, who has experience. It's one of the things I teach crisis communication, and I always tell my students, like, they're always taking on all of these different things, like, but and when you're talking about death or anything else, and you're informing people from a crisis communicator point of view, like you need to inform somebody that, someone may have died, a loved one may have died, but you are not a trained trauma person. That's somebody else's job. And so I think recognizing your own limitations is really important. While we should use and implement all of these things, like some of you might actually be trauma, certified and all of these other things, and that's great. But if you're not, like recognizing, like, I am not capable of handling this, I think that's a really important thing. And then knowing who to kind of go to with that regard. One of the things that was really difficult and to consider as well is like the cultural implications. There are certain cultures where it is not okay, like it is not as socially acceptable to go, seek out help with therapy and everything else. That was something I had faced in Hong Kong. And so also finding someone within that culture that might be useful is also, I think, a really key step if you are going to go that approach, which I do really recommend.
Yeah, I think re-traumatization can indeed be unpredictable, but part of being the trauma-informed storytellers that we are is taking the proactive steps to prepare for these possibilities. So, for me, that looks like not just knowing that my interviewees have access to campus therapy. It's actually talking to campus therapy or talking to the therapist that we are recommending folks and saying, hey, we're starting this study and we may have people that we're going to send over. And for nonprofit organizations, it could also be like, oh, when we're doing interview day, and we're actually going to hire a therapist or a counselor to come with us and be on site for the day, and whether that's in staff or through a partnership that you have. And I think the most important piece is making sure that you have your resources lined up prior
Mhm.
to beginning, because it's a lot harder for the individual and for you as the kind of uh, facilitator of everything to have to do damage control than it is and to go and find that therapist or go and find that culturally sensitive person than it is to say, oh, you know what? If at any time any of us feel uncomfortable, and we can just pull in our therapist and they can help facilitate the conversation moving forward.
That sounds smart, having everybody be trauma informed, but then have a larger team to be able to focus on different areas. I've seen a great question from Augusta and what if the producer doesn't choose to include an interviewee, but they want to be included? And if I can tag on to that, I'm hearing that, if you've gone through the process of having someone share their story and they're feeling like they may be part of the project, how disappointing, could that be if then they're ultimately not part of that? What would you advise?
I'm going to leave this one to Cody. I'll jump in at the end.
That is a fantastic question. I think it's important to recognize like that significance of agency and that respect for everybody that's involved, including the producer's role in that. As much as we are also extending that agency to the folks that we are interviewing, us as researchers or practitioners also have agency, and communicating that at the beginning in that consent agreement is also where we can avoid some of that. Really, it comes back to informed consent, and is everyone aware of the all possible outcomes, including your interview not being included at all? And so setting those expectations early and clarifying that not all stories or participants may be included, but then also following up with acknowledging their effort and saying your story and perspective, they're incredibly valuable, and while it may not fit in this particular production, it's still very much informed and shaped the project in important ways. And then also, I mean, it's 2025 now, and there's alternative avenues to share those stories. I am a huge believer in, if it's comfortable with you and, and the person being interviewed, well, maybe it didn't make it into the book, but it'd make a great blog, or it'd make a great social post, or we could tell your story in a different way. And so, if possible, providing other ways for their story to be shared can be a way to still feel like the person is seeing it like a tangible outcome from the effort that they put in. And then ultimately provide closure. And we want to make sure that if their story wasn't included, that they still feel respected and supported, and know that their involvement impacted this project regardless, even if it didn't appear in the final cut or final production.
Yeah, and we've got a great suggestion in the chat from Kimberly about individuals who do not show up in a film or video still being involved in an impact campaign as a speaker. So to that point of just like there's creative ways to still be involved, even if in the case of a film, you're not going to appear. I am so torn. We're a minute till the hour, and I'm just seeing amazing questions. Easily, I can say the questions about consent forms or samples. The three of us will put our heads together, and we can include that in the video and the resources listed below what we'll share with the recording. Ron, I am seeing your amazing questions, and I have a hunch we cannot do justice to them right now.
Yeah.
But really,
Great question, though.
yes, looking at common ground and deepening partisan divides. So stay tuned. I feel like that's going to be a newsletter, LinkedIn. We'll be back in touch. Can we make a
Perfect example of what to do when we don't get to include everybody. Great
there we go.
topic.
Yeah.
One last, we may go just a smidgen over the hour, but if there's one, I mean, we've covered so much. If there's one thing that you want people to remember, what would that be?
Oof. We're all human, and we're all going to make mistakes. And, I can maybe quickly touch on Ron's thing about someone who's being in Western North Carolina, where there's a lot of political division. One of the things that's really amazing is like if your Biden Harris sign in your yard and you're living next to somebody with their Trump sign in their yard, we are all impacted by that same tragedy.
Included all this already. Thank you.
That's one of the things that I think kind of brings people together is, that shared collective, a sense of community. At the end of the day, we were all impacted by it, regardless of what your political beliefs were. And I think within our community, while that wasn't necessarily like always shown on the news, like I think most people came together and politics weren't necessarily always a part of it. It was about like trying to make sure your neighbor had water and that they could charge their phones, that they could connect with loved ones. So I think understanding that we also kind of are going things together is a really important way of thinking about that.
Absolutely. I think for me, it's really just recognizing that we're all on this journey, and as well-intentioned as we are, sometimes we still get it wrong. And so and being open and to suggestions from not just our peers, but the people that we are interviewing is crucial, because otherwise, how will we become better communicators?
Thank you both. Thank you everyone for fabulous questions. We will put our heads together and get answers and resources. Thank you for joining. This is an ongoing series, so I encourage you to join us next month for a conversation with Seth David Radwell, who's the author of American Schism. When you leave the webinar, a quick poll will pop up. Please be a helper. That takes about 15 seconds for just a few questions, and we value your input. For now, be well, do good, and have a wonderful rest of the day and weekend. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.